Hello everyone, and welcome to a brand new video on Hematocrit. In this video, of course, we're going to discuss Hematocrit. So let's get into what is Hematocrit. What is the value that we call Hematocrit? Hematocrit is a very important lab value. So what this is the percentage of red blood cells in whole blood. So if I have a whole blood sample, okay, what I'm going to do is I want to know how many red blood cells. This could help us diagnose some things. So let's say I have a red blood cell sample here that I've collected from my patient. I collect whole blood out of my patient here. So let's say this is a typical phlebotomy sample here. I'll even be try to make all the medical people watching happy. Put a little purple cap on it, and let's say we have our blood here, and we want to know how much of that is actually made up of red blood cells. One of the things we will do is we will take it through a centrifuge. It undergoes centrifugation, and I will then begin to separate. So my tubes, if I put a sample of this into a tube and centrifuge it, what I'm going to get is something like what we talked about from one of our last videos, is that blood will separate out according to mass, where my red blood cells here will separate red blood cells, RBCs. Sometimes I try to write it a lot neater, and it doesn't want to do that. Red blood cells. And then we might also have our little bit of our buffy coat here. And then our plasma here. And this all gets separated based on centrifugation. Because we've centrifuged it, we sometimes call hematocrit a packed cell volume. And what this basically can tell us is what percent here is this out of the whole. If I have a total blood volume, what is the hematocrit? And that's the percentage of whole blood that's made up of RBCs. Very important value. Now, there are a lot of things that are used in normal laboratory tests. And let's talk about what normal values are. Because before we talk about any changes, we always want to know what are normal values. And always start with your normal, that is where we want to go. Now, there is a different normal for male patient and a different normal for female patients. Now, why is this? Is that males have the testosterone. These help to increase the red blood cell count. Men have typically more blood volume because they're bigger. They have a higher red blood cell count because of androgens, circulating androgens. Now, when it comes to a male's hematocrit, his is about 38.3% to about 48.6% for a typical normal value. It's somewhere between those two numbers. Where in a female, it's about 35.5% to about 44.9%. And these are the normal hematocrits. Now, these hematocrits can tell us a lot. Now, let's just say, for example, I go and I take a hematocrit here, and I go and find one, and it is out of that normal. It's not normal. It's an abnormal hematocrit. Now, normal levels are what we would see, and then it can be too high or too low. For example, here, what if we have a dramatically increased hematocrit? What if hematocrit is quite high for a patient? So let's say I have an increased hematocrit. Okay, an increase in hematocrit. So if we went and measured this in this patient, we would see that this percentage here, this percentage is far greater than normal. So there are a few things. Number one, we might look at it and say maybe this is a blood cell problem. Too many red blood cells, many, blood cell, polycythemia. We might say they have polycythemia. We might also claim this patient is dehydrated. Now we might look at their other values. We might look at their hemoglobin and things like that. We might look at other things, but this is a quick and very insightful test that we can do. All right. Now, so what we want to see next is what if it's our hematocrit has been lowered? What if we have a blood that's made up of less red blood cells? So this right here, we would have a very decreased hematocrit, so more plasma here. Okay. Now, we might immediately, with this decreased hematocrit, if you look here, with this decreased hematocrit, you will notice that that is definitely much smaller. We might go ahead and say anemia. We might want to go ahead and say maybe they have anemia. It could be the patient's overly hydrated. Okay, overhydration. So we might look at that as well. So there is, remember, when it comes to high hematocrit, this means there is a high RBC count. And when they have a low hematocrit, there is a low RBC count. And these are equivalent things here, percentage-wise. Now, let's just kind of look at how we might measure it. Now, one of the ways we might measure it is we might go and say, how many RBCs do we have? What is our red blood cell volume? What is the volume of red blood cells that I can measure in my sample? And I can divide that over total blood volume. Of course, multiply that by 100, and that will give you a percentage. Or I might be able to go here and I can say, well, what is the actual number of red blood cells I count? I actually count red blood cells using a machine, and then I can multiply that by the mean corpuscular volume, the average volume of red blood cell. And I can divide that by the total blood volume of a sample that I put in. Of course, multiply that by 100 to turn it into a percentage. And these are how we can do that. Let's do it the good old-fashioned way. Let's just say that I have a hematocrit tube here, okay? And in this hematocrit tube, I've gone and I make my my blood measurement here. And let's say that I measure this blood here to the mark, and I use a measuring device. We have a measuring device here, let's say regularly ruled measuring device that I've gone and used to measure. And let's say we measure this out to be at the mark of 20 millimeters. Now, the rest of the blood is added in here. We centrifuge it down and we have all the plasma and everything. I'll even add a little bit of a buffy coat there just for accuracy. And let's say we measure the top of this at 50 millimeters. Okay, so what have we done? Well, Hematocrit 2 measures total blood volume at 50 millimeters, packed red blood cell volume at about 20 millimeters. Now, with this tells us a lot. So we could say I have my 20, so let's say I want to calculate my hematocrit. Hematocrit here, I have my 20, and I want to divide that by my 50, okay? and I find this value here. Let's say we get it, and I have that hematocrit. We find out that this is, of course, 0.4. Multiply that by 100, and I get 40% for my hematocrit value. I would say that this right here is 40% of overall blood if this was measured correctly. Okay. My drawing isn't perfectly to scale, of course, but okay. That would be what it would be. Okay, so based on my equations there. So really a simple little video to go over basics of hematocrit and things that I would like to talk about, and what happens when it's high, it's low, what this might indicate, some basics that we can always compare to other parameters like hemoglobin and things like that. Rules of three, etc., that you guys may already know about. So guys, thank you so much for watching my video on hematocrit. I hope you found it useful, but as always, don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. But just as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.